The bustling city streets were alive with their usual chaos. Cars honked impatiently, people shuffled across crosswalks, and the faint hum of chatter filled the air. Among the sea of faces and the blur of daily routines, one officer stood out, Sergeant Mark Reynolds. Known for his stern demeanor and no-nonsense approach to law enforcement, he often operated under the belief that the badge gave him the ultimate authority. It was a belief that on this particular day would be put to the ultimate test. It started as a routine patrol, or so Mark thought. He was stationed near City Square, an area that was both a commercial hub and a melting pot of diverse communities. While the location often saw its share of minor infractions, today was different. The air seemed to hum with an unspoken tension, though Mark dismissed it as another busy afternoon in the city. As Mark monitored the crowd, his attention was drawn to a sleek black car that had parked slightly askew near a red curb. A minor violation, perhaps, but in Mark's eyes it was a glaring offense, an opportunity to enforce the law and, in his mind, restore order. Without hesitation, he approached the vehicle, clipboard in hand and his face set in a stern expression. The car door opened, and out stepped a sharply dressed man. His tailored suit, polished shoes, and confident stride hinted at someone accustomed to authority. Yet there was an air of calmness about him, an unspoken assurance that seemed to ripple through the atmosphere. The man was Judge Terrence Morgan, a respected figure in the community and known for his unwavering commitment to justice and equality. Mark didn't recognize him at first. To Mark, he was just another civilian who needed to be reminded of the rules. "Sir, you're parked illegally," Mark began, his tone clipped and authoritative. Terrence raised an eyebrow, a slight smile playing on his lips. "Officer, I was only here briefly to pick up some documents. I understand the rules and I appreciate your diligence." But Mark wasn't in the mood for understanding. To him, Terrence's calm demeanor came off as dismissive, even defiant. "I don't need excuses," Mark snapped, his voice rising slightly. "The law is the law. Step aside while I issue the ticket." What happened next would change both their lives forever. As Terrence moved to retrieve his ID from the car, Mark misinterpreted the action. Perhaps it was a split-second decision fueled by frustration or an overestimation of the situation's seriousness. Whatever the reason, Mark's hand moved faster than his thoughts, and a sharp sound echoed through the street. A slap, loud enough to make nearby pedestrians stop and stare. For a moment, there was silence. Terrence stood still, his head slightly turned from the force of the slap. But he didn't retaliate. He didn't raise his voice or lose his composure. Instead, he turned slowly to face Mark, his gaze steady and unwavering. It wasn't anger that burned in his eyes. It was something deeper, a quiet power that made Mark's stomach twist in a way he couldn't explain. "I'd suggest you think very carefully about your next move, officer," Terrence said, his voice calm but laced with authority. The words hung in the air like a thundercloud ready to burst. Mark felt a flicker of doubt, but his pride and the badge on his chest pushed him to double down. "You don't get to threaten me," he barked. "I don't care who you think you are." Terrence reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek leather wallet. He flipped it open to reveal an ID card that made Mark's heart sink. The realization hit him like a freight train. Judge Terrence Morgan, one of the most prominent legal figures in the state, now stood before him. The crowd, which had grown during the commotion, began murmuring among themselves. Some had their phones out, recording the entire exchange. Mark's confidence wavered as the gravity of his actions began to sink in, but it was too late to undo what had been done. Terrence took a step closer, his gaze locked on Mark's. "I've spent my career upholding the very laws you swore to protect," he said, his voice steady but firm. "And today, you've shown me what happens when power is misused." The words stung more than Mark cared to admit. He wanted to respond, to defend himself, but the lump in his throat made it impossible. And then, in a move that sent chills through Mark, Terrence calmly pulled out his phone. "This isn't about me," he said, almost to himself. "It's about ensuring this doesn't happen to anyone else." Mark felt the weight of 1,000 eyes on him, those of the crowd, the cameras, and most of all, the man who stood unwavering before him. He knew his career, his reputation, and possibly his future hung in the balance. And for the first time in years, the usually unshakable officer felt a pang of fear. A fear that soon turned into a desperate plea for mercy. But what would happen next remained uncertain, leaving everyone wondering how this shocking moment would unfold. Mark stood frozen, his mind racing as the crowd around him continued to grow. Every whispered comment, every click of a phone camera, felt like another nail in the coffin of his authority. He had always prided himself on being in control, but now, control was slipping through his fingers like sand. His chest tightened with a mixture of frustration and fear, though he tried to mask it with a scowl. Terrence, on the other hand, exuded an almost unnerving calm. His every movement, from the way he adjusted his suit jacket to the deliberate pace at which he typed something into his phone, seemed to underline the difference between them. Mark felt like he was on the losing side of a silent battle, one he hadn't even realized he was fighting until now. The tension in the air was palpable. Some of the onlookers whispered to one another, their words barely audible over the hum of city noise. "Isn't that Judge Morgan? Did that cop really slap him? This is going to blow up, for sure." The weight of their voices pressed against Mark like an invisible force. He wanted to lash out, to regain control of the situation, but his instincts told him it would only make things worse. Terrence turned to the crowd, addressing them with the same composed authority he had shown throughout the encounter. "Thank you for your concern," he said, his voice steady but loud enough to carry over the murmurs. "I assure you, this matter will be handled appropriately." His words were simple, but their meaning was clear. He didn't need the crowd's intervention. He had the situation firmly in hand. Mark's heart sank further. Every word Terrence spoke seemed to paint him as the villain, a role he had never imagined himself in. He opened his mouth to speak, to defend himself, but the words caught in his throat. What could he say that wouldn't make him sound guilty, defensive, or worse? The more he thought about it, the more trapped he felt. The crowd began to disperse slowly, though a few people lingered, still filming or watching from a distance. Terrence remained where he was, his phone now tucked away, his focus entirely on Mark. The silence between them stretched on, heavy and suffocating. Finally, Terrence spoke again, his tone measured and calm. "Officer Reynolds, is it?" Mark flinched slightly at the sound of his name. He nodded, his throat too dry to speak. "I'd like to understand something," Terrence continued. "Was there anything about my demeanor, my actions, that made you feel threatened?" The question caught Mark off guard. It wasn't accusatory or angry, but it carried a weight that made him uneasy. "I know," he stammered finally, his voice shaky. "I didn't feel threatened. It's just, you didn't comply right away, and I thought." He trailed off, realizing how weak his explanation sounded even to his own ears. Terrence raised an eyebrow, but he didn't interrupt. He let the silence linger, forcing Mark to confront the inadequacy of his own words. "You thought what?" Terrence prompted gently. "That a minor parking violation justified physical aggression. That I posed such a danger you had to escalate immediately." Mark swallowed hard. He didn't have an answer, at least not one that wouldn't dig him deeper into the hole he was already in. His mind raced, searching for something, anything, to say that might redeem him. But Terrence wasn't finished. "I've presided over countless cases," he said, his voice firm, but not unkind. "I've seen how a single moment of poor judgment can ripple outward, affecting lives in ways that are often irreversible. Do you understand the gravity of what you've done today, Officer Reynolds?" The question wasn't rhetorical, but Mark didn't know how to respond. His chest felt tight, his palms slick with sweat. He had always considered himself a good cop, someone who upheld the law and served the community. But now, faced with the consequences of his actions, he was beginning to question that image of himself. Terrence took a step closer, his eyes locking onto Mark's with an intensity that was impossible to ignore. "This isn't just about me," he said quietly, his tone carrying an edge of urgency. "It's about what you represent. When you wear that badge, you're not just an individual, you're a symbol of justice, of fairness, of protection. And today, you tarnished that symbol." The words hit Mark like a blow. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but the truth in Terrence's statement was undeniable. He had let his frustration, his pride, and perhaps even his unconscious biases dictate his actions. And now, he was paying the price. Terrence took a deep breath, his expression softening slightly. "I don't want to ruin your life, Officer Reynolds," he said. "But I can't ignore what's happened here. Accountability is the cornerstone of justice. Without it, the system falls apart." Mark's knees felt weak. He had always believed himself to be on the right side of the law. But now, he was beginning to see how easily that belief could be shattered. He looked down at his hands, at the badge clipped to his chest, and for the first time in years, he felt ashamed. Terrence straightened, his professional demeanor returning. "I'll be filing a formal complaint," he said, his tone matter-of-fact. "This isn't about revenge. It's about ensuring that incidents like this don't happen again. I hope you'll take this as an opportunity to reflect on your actions and what they mean for the people you serve." With that, Terrence turned and walked away, his every step radiating the quiet dignity that had defined him throughout the encounter. Mark watched him go, feeling a mix of relief and dread. Relief that the confrontation was over, but dread at what would come next. As the crowd finally dispersed and the street returned to its usual rhythm, Mark stood alone, his thoughts a chaotic swirl. He knew this wasn't the end of the story, not for him, not for Terrence, and not for the system they both represented. And as much as he wanted to run from the consequences of his actions, he knew there was no escaping them. The hours that followed felt like days for Mark. He couldn't shake the image of Judge Morgan walking away, his calm and commanding presence lingering in Mark's mind like an echo. Even as he returned to the station, his colleagues' casual banter and the hum of daily operations seemed distant, almost unreal. Mark sat at his desk, staring blankly at the reports he was supposed to complete. For the first time in his career, he wasn't sure what to do next. News of the incident had already begun to spread. Whispers circulated among the officers, each one like a small stab at Mark's confidence. Though no one confronted him directly, their sideways glances and hushed conversations were enough to confirm what he already suspected. His actions were being scrutinized. He could only imagine how quickly the video of the slap was spreading online. By the time Mark was called into the captain's office, the weight of the situation was almost unbearable. Captain Wilson was a seasoned officer, known for his firm but fair approach. As Mark stepped into the office, he could see the disappointment etched into the captain's face. The door clicked shut behind him, and the room seemed to shrink. "Reynolds, sit down," the captain said, gesturing to the chair in front of his desk. Mark obeyed, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. The captain leaned back in his chair, studying him for a moment before speaking. "I've been hearing things, and none of them are good. Care to explain what happened today?" Mark opened his mouth, then closed it again. How could he explain something he barely understood himself? Finally, he managed to say, "It was a misunderstanding, sir. Things escalated faster than I expected." The captain's brow furrowed. "A misunderstanding?" he repeated, his tone skeptical. "Reynolds, we're not talking about a routine traffic stop gone wrong. You struck a sitting judge in broad daylight. That's not something you can brush off as a misunderstanding." Mark felt the blood drain from his face. "I didn't realize who he was," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "That doesn't make it better," the captain said sharply. "In fact, it makes it worse. If you can't control yourself in a situation as minor as a parking violation, how can I trust you in more serious encounters? This isn't just about you, Reynolds. It's about this department and how the public sees us." Mark looked down, unable to meet the captain's gaze. He knew the captain was right. He had let his emotions get the better of him, and now the consequences were spiraling out of control. The captain sighed, his expression softening slightly. "Look, I'm not here to tear you down," he said. "But you need to understand the gravity of this situation. Judge Morgan has already filed a formal complaint, and Internal Affairs is getting involved. This isn't going away quietly." Mark's stomach churned at the mention of Internal Affairs. The words carried a sense of finality, a confirmation that his actions were now part of an official investigation. He nodded numbly, his mind racing with thoughts of what this would mean for his career his reputation, and his future. Take some time to think about how you're going to handle this, the captain continued. And for now, you're on administrative leave. Turn in your badge and weapon before you leave the building. The words hit Mark like a punch to the gut. His badge and weapon were more than just tools of the job. They were symbols of his identity, his purpose. Handing them over felt like losing a part of himself, but he knew better than to argue. He stood, nodded stiffly, and left the office without another word. As Mark walked through the station, the weight of his colleagues' stares felt heavier than ever. He handed over his badge and weapon at the front desk, the act feeling almost surreal. Without them, he felt exposed, vulnerable in a way he hadn't experienced before. When Mark finally stepped outside, the cool evening air hit him like a shock. The city around him buzzed with life, oblivious to the turmoil consuming him. He started walking, unsure of where he was going or what he was hoping to find. All he knew was that he needed to clear his head. Meanwhile, Terrence sat in his study, reviewing the day's events with a heavy heart. He had spent years fighting for justice and equality, yet moments like these reminded him how far there was still to go. He wasn't angry, exactly. Anger felt too simple, too fleeting for the complexity of what he felt. Instead, he was deeply saddened, both for himself and for what the incident represented. Terrence's phone buzzed on the desk, interrupting his thoughts. He picked it up and saw a message from a colleague, a fellow judge who had seen the video, and reached out to offer support. The message was kind, but it only deepened Terrence's resolve. This wasn't about seeking revenge or making an example out of Mark. It was about holding the system accountable and ensuring incidents like this became a thing of the past. As the night wore on, both men found themselves grappling with the weight of their choices. For Terrence, it was about deciding how far to take the complaint and what it could mean for the larger conversation about systemic issues in law enforcement. For Mark, it was about confronting his own biases and mistakes, and whether he had the courage to face the consequences head-on. The city slept, but the tension between them remained alive, an invisible thread pulling their lives closer together even as they tried to move forward. Neither of them knew what the coming days would bring, but one thing was certain: this was only the beginning. The conflict they found themselves in was not just about a single slap or a single officer. It was about a system, a culture, and the struggle to bridge the gap between power and justice. Mark sat in the dim light of his living room, the weight of the past day pressing down on him like a lead blanket. His uniform lay neatly folded on the coffee table, a stark reminder of what he might soon lose. His phone buzzed incessantly on the counter, each notification another link to the chaos unfolding online. Videos of the incident had gone viral, spreading faster than he could comprehend. Comments ranged from outrage to mockery, and his name was now attached to a storm he couldn't outrun. He finally picked up the phone and scrolled through the messages. Friends, colleagues, even distant acquaintances had reached out, offering everything from advice to outright condemnation. His family group chat was a mix of confusion and concern, his mother pleading with him to call her. But it wasn't the messages from people he knew that stung the most. It was the strangers, the ones who saw him as nothing more than a headline: disgraced officer, rogue cop, racist aggressor. The labels cut deep, each one forcing him to confront parts of himself he wasn't ready to face. Meanwhile, across town, Terrence sat in his office, surrounded by files and notes. The formal complaint he had filed was just the beginning. Since the incident, he had been inundated with calls from reporters, activists, and legal professionals, all wanting his perspective. He'd been careful with his words, emphasizing the need for systemic change rather than personal vengeance. Still, he couldn't ignore the larger implications of what had happened. This wasn't just about him. It was about a culture that allowed such incidents to occur in the first place. Terrence leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He had always believed in the power of dialogue, of bridging gaps through understanding and education. But how do you reach someone who doesn't even see the gap? He thought about Mark, about the anger and fear he had seen in the officer's eyes. There was more to it than just a parking violation, he was sure of that. But what exactly had driven Mark to react the way he did? The question gnawed at him, a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. The next day, Mark was summoned to a meeting with the internal affairs team. He arrived early, his stomach churning with a mix of dread and determination. The conference room was cold and sterile, its walls adorned with framed policies and department accolades. Two investigators greeted him with professional detachment, their expressions giving nothing away. "Officer Reynolds, thank you for coming," one of them said, motioning for him to sit. The other opened a file, the pages within crackling ominously. "We've reviewed the footage and statements from the incident. We'd like to hear your account of what happened." Mark hesitated, his mind scrambling to piece together a coherent narrative. Every word felt like a potential trap, every pause a chance for them to dissect his actions further. I made a mistake," he began, his voice shaky. "I let my frustration get the better of me, and I overreacted." The investigators exchanged a glance, their pens moving swiftly across their notepads. "Can you elaborate on what caused that frustration?" one of them asked. Mark swallowed hard. "It was a busy day," he said. "I was already dealing with several tense situations, and when Judge Morgan didn't respond immediately, He trailed off, realizing how hollow his explanation sounded. "Officer Reynolds," the second investigator said, her tone firm but not unkind, "this isn't just about one moment. It's about what that moment reveals about your judgment and decision-making under pressure. Do you understand why this incident has garnered so much attention?" Mark nodded, his chest tight. "Because I was wrong," he admitted. "I shouldn't have acted the way I did." The investigator leaned forward slightly, her gaze piercing. "It's more than that. This is about trust. When an officer acts impulsively or unfairly, it damages the public's trust in law enforcement as a whole. That trust is hard to build and easy to lose. Do you understand the implications of your actions?" Mark's throat felt dry, but he nodded again. "I do," he said quietly. As the meeting continued, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in around him. The questions were relentless, each one peeling back another layer of his defenses. By the time he walked out of the room, he felt completely exposed, his carefully constructed identity as a good cop crumbling under the weight of scrutiny. At the same time, Terrence was preparing for a public forum where he had been invited to speak about the incident and its broader implications. The event was packed, the audience a mix of community members, activists, and media representatives. As he took the stage, he could feel the weight of their expectations pressing down on him. Terrence began by recounting the incident, his tone measured but firm. "What happened to me was not an isolated event," he said, his voice steady. "It is a symptom of a system that often operates without accountability, a system that prioritizes authority over justice." The audience listened intently, their faces reflecting a mix of anger and hope. Terrence spoke about the need for training, for empathy, for officers to see the humanity in the people they served. But as he spoke, he couldn't help but wonder if Mark was watching, if his words would reach the person who needed to hear them the most. Back in his apartment, Mark sat on the edge of his couch, the forum playing on his TV. Terrence's words cut through the noise in his mind, each one striking a chord he hadn't expected. For the first time, he began to see the incident from a perspective other than his own. It wasn't just about him or Terrence. It was about a system, a culture, and a responsibility he hadn't fully understood. As the forum ended, Mark felt a strange mix of emotions: guilt, anger, and a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. He didn't know what the next steps would be, but he knew one thing for certain: he couldn't ignore the truth any longer. Mark couldn't sleep that night. The words Terrence had spoken at the forum echoed in his mind, challenging every justification he had clung to since the incident. He wanted to dismiss it, to tell himself that the judge was only saying what people wanted to hear, but deep down he couldn't. The truth had slipped through the cracks of his defenses, and now it refused to be ignored. Yet, just as he felt a glimmer of clarity, his phone buzzed with a new notification that sent his stomach into free fall. A news article had surfaced, detailing a previous complaint filed against Mark months ago. It was a case he thought had been resolved quietly, a minor dispute over a traffic stop where the driver had accused him of excessive force. Though the department had cleared him of any wrongdoing at the time, the resurfacing of the case painted him in an even harsher light. The article was relentless, piecing together a narrative that portrayed Mark as a ticking time bomb. He read the comments underneath, each one harsher than the last. This guy shouldn't have been on the force to begin with. How many more have to suffer before they hold him accountable? Disgraceful. The words stung, not just because of their cruelty, but because Mark couldn't argue against them. He had convinced himself for years that he was just doing his job. But now those justifications felt thin and hollow. At the same time, Terrence was alerted to the same article. A friend had sent it to him, suggesting it could be useful in his advocacy efforts. But instead of feeling vindicated, Terrence felt uneasy. The story painted Mark as irredeemable, a caricature of everything wrong with the system. Yet Terrence couldn't shake the image of Mark's face during the confrontation. There had been anger, yes, but also fear that hinted at a deeper story. Terrence wasn't excusing what had happened, but he also couldn't help but wonder if there was more to Mark than what the headlines portrayed. The next day, a second twist came when Terrence received an anonymous email. The subject line simply read, "You need to see this." Attached was a video, grainy and shaky, showing an interaction between Mark and a senior officer from years ago. In the footage, the senior officer was berating Mark in front of a group of recruits, his tone condescending and humiliating. "You think you're a hero?" the officer sneered. "You're nothing but a rookie with a chip on his shoulder. Get it together, or you'll be out of here before you can blink." Terrence replayed the video several times, trying to piece together what it meant. Was this an isolated moment or part of a larger pattern? The footage seemed to suggest a culture within the department that fostered hostility and pressure, a culture that could easily push someone like Mark toward bad decisions. Terrence felt the weight of a new question pressing down on him. Was it enough to hold individuals accountable without addressing the system that shaped them? Mark, oblivious to the video's existence, was dealing with his own revelation. An old friend from the academy, someone he hadn't spoken to in years, called him out of the blue. "Mark, I saw the forum," the friend said. "I know you're going through it right now, but I need to tell you something. Remember that parking violation case last year? The one where the department backed you up?" Mark's chest tightened. "What about it?" "I shouldn't be telling you this, but the driver? They filed a second complaint. The department buried it. They didn't even tell you. I thought you should know." Mark felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him. He had trusted the department to protect him, to guide him when things got tough. But now he realized that trust had been one-sided. They had shielded him, yes, but only to maintain their own image. And in doing so, they had let him spiral further, unchecked and unaware of the damage he was causing. As the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, the stakes rose for both men. Terrence wrestled with whether to share the video publicly, knowing it could shift the narrative, but also fearing it might deflect attention from the systemic issues he was fighting to address. Mark, meanwhile, found himself questioning not just his actions, but the very foundation of his career. The line between right and wrong, between accountability and betrayal, was growing blurrier by the second. And then, just as the tension reached its peak, a new development threw everything into chaos. A press conference was announced, scheduled for the following morning. The department, the judge, and key community leaders would all be present. Speculation ran wild, with some predicting that Mark would be officially terminated and others suggesting that a broader reform initiative might be unveiled. Mark's mind raced as he imagined what the press conference might bring. Would this be his final moment as an officer, or could it somehow be an opportunity for redemption? Terrence, too, felt the weight of the moment. This was no longer just about a single incident. It was about what kind of story they wanted to tell the world. One of division and blame, or one of reckoning and change. As the city buzzed with anticipation, both men prepared to face the truth, each unaware of how their paths would collide again in ways neither could have predicted.